Hello and welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. So today we're going to have a little bit of a chit chat about kind of my thought process in how we ended up with dairy goats instead of a dairy cow on our homestead. Right now their mamas are out grazing, and so we'll go find them. My husband Levi and I bought this homestead in 2019, and it came with this barn as well as a chicken coop, a garden, and it came with the property fenced in with electric wire. And initially when I saw the barn and I knew it was fenced in, I had expressed to the couple that lived here before us how excited I was because I wanted a dairy cow, and it seemed like it was perfectly set up for a dairy cow, which it basically was. You don't need a lot of intense fencing to hold in a well-trained dairy cow. Usually it just takes one strand of electric wire and you're good. And that was here. Hi. So I bought a book on dairy cows. It was actually a book I saw recommended called Keeping a Family Cow. I actually talked about that recently in a video that I did about some of our favorite homesteading books. So we didn't have the farm yet. We hadn't closed, but things were moving forward, and I read this book cover to cover. I was so excited about getting a cow. When it came down to it, when we finally moved here in 2019, I saw for the first time in a really long time how big cows really are. Our neighbor keeps Black Angus cattle, and at first that seemed like a really cool situation. They keep a bull on their property, and I figured, oh, we'll get to know them. Maybe we can put our dairy cow in with their bull, you know, every so often, and that's how we can bring our cow into milk. And really, that's not a bad idea. It could have worked out that way, but it didn't, and I'm not sad. So a lot of people kind of assume that people start out with dairy goats and then graduate to a dairy cow. A lot of people do that, and that's completely valid. That's not what we're doing here. We plan to keep dairy goats forever and ever. So during the time when I was here that summer in 2019, without anything but a few chickens, I was talking to my neighbor about kind of how he raises his cattle. Now my neighbor, with his beef cattle, he has a very hands-off approach. He doesn't help with birthing or anything. If there's ever an issue with those cattle that might need care above and beyond what he can do himself, he very frequently just takes them to the processor. And that's the way he chooses to do things. It works really well for him. However, when you have a homestead and you have one dairy cow, if something happens to that one cow, it's a really big hit to a farm. He has a whole herd of these animals for meat, and that's a different situation. So in thinking about the what if, it really had my thought process shifting more towards what we have now. So I've talked about it a little bit in past videos, but before we had a farm, before we had a homestead, we actually mostly purchased goat's milk cheese, goat's milk, and other goat's milk products if we could get our hands on it. For me, goat's milk is just more digestible, and I think that that's because goats automatically produce A2 proteins in their milk. I'll have to remember exactly how it goes, but I believe that there's the A2 protein, and they can carry 2 genes for producing A2 milk. They could carry 1 gene for producing A2 milk, or they could carry 2 genes of the other protein, and I forget what it's called, but I'll put it here on the screen. And for a lot of people, A2 milk is just more digestible. So when I was looking into getting a dairy cow, I was going to purchase an A2 dairy animal, and those animals are very expensive. And when you put a lot of money upfront into one animal, to me, that's just a really scary investment, because as I mentioned before, anything can kind of go wrong, and that just seemed like too much of a risk to bear on that investment for me at the time. And because we were buying goat's milk products at the store anyway, it honestly just made more sense for us to go with goats. So as I was researching in our area a little bit further, I realized that there is not a vet that comes out to our area to service your animals on farm. And that's the reason why, if there's anything wrong with my neighbor's animals, he just takes them into slaughter and takes the loss on that and buys a new animal, because it's an undertaking to load up a large animal and bring it in to a vet, and it may not necessarily be worth it for everybody. So in realizing that, I understood that if anything's going to go wrong with my dairy animal, more than likely I'm going to have to be able to take care of it myself. At the time, my husband Levi was in the military, so it was a very real consideration for me to think about the fact that there will be several things that I'm going to have to handle on my own. And cows are very large, and so that was very intimidating to me. So goats were looking like the better choice for us at the time, and I can say that they are still the best choice for us now. If ever one of my goats needs help giving birth, I have been able to assist them. I know that oftentimes cattle can give birth on their own just fine, and there's no complications. Complications do arise even though they're few and far between, and I just didn't have a solid option to be able to get help and get assistance with that animal on farm. Even now, I can't get assistance from a vet if one of my goats needs help in birth. And we've had experiences where that was the case, and I did have to put a goat down for a ruptured uterus. Now, these are hard topics to talk about. They are, but they're real world experiences where you kind of have to think about, what are you going to do? What are you going to do in that situation where you need to put an animal down and then you need to dispose of it? What are you going to do when you've had to put down potentially your only dairy animal and you've got to start from scratch? That's where, for me, a herd of goats, it really makes more sense, because while it was devastating to lose the one doe that we did, it was a couple years ago, she's not the only dairy animal that I had. I have the whole rest of the herd to kind of make up for what we lost in her. And that same concept is true for breeding mishaps as well. I know quite a few people who keep dairy cows that have had a hard time getting their dairy cow bred, and when that happens and it's your one animal that you are dependent on for your dairy, that can be very, very frustrating. I can't remember how many goats I bred this fall, but let's say one of them happens to not take her pregnancy, which happens sometimes for various reasons. It's really not a big deal. Of course, I would like all of the breedings to work out, but if for some reason one of my does doesn't take in her pregnancy, it's not like a catastrophic loss to our farm. You also want to consider some of the kind of everyday maintenance tasks that any dairy animal is going to need. And one of the things that really made me lean more heavy towards getting a goat versus a cow is hoof trimming. We live in an area where the ground is very mucky and very boggy, so the goat's hooves don't get worn down, and the same would be true for a cow. And it's more of an ordeal to trim cattle hooves than it is goat hooves. And so in general, even though goats are kind of well known for like keeling over and dying, number one, that hasn't been my experience, but also their everyday maintenance is more manageable for one person to do. Another consideration you might have in trying to decide whether or not goats are going to work for you is you want to assess your land and figure out, will it better support a cow or will it better support goats? A lot of people will tell you that goats don't graze. I am here to tell you that we mostly just have flat pasture land. We do have this pond here with trees around it, but if you don't give goats another choice, they absolutely will graze. Now, is it super ideal for a goat to graze with their head close to the ground? It's not, because they can be prone to getting worms. There are ways to combat worms, and I will get into all of that as we go further into the series. But don't think that if all you have is pasture land like this, that you can't keep goats. You absolutely can, and you can keep them well. And the same really goes for cattle. I mean, if all you have is brush like this, I have seen people keep cattle like that. You just might have to consider that they might need more inputs off farm in order to keep them in good condition and producing well. You also want to consider, how much milk do you really want or need to deal with? From what I have heard, an average producing Jersey will give you about 5 gallons of milk a day, which 5 times 7 days out of the week is 35 gallons. Think about what you're going to do with 35 gallons of milk. This past spring in peak production, I was bringing in about 2.5 gallons a day, and I only milk once a day. I was not milking all of these goats to get that. I think at the top of it, I was milking 9 dairy goats once a day and getting 2.5 gallons, and that worked out to over 14 gallons per week to figure out what to do with. And it was nearly overwhelming many times for me. So think about that. The volume of milk that a dairy cow can bring you is absolutely a blessing, especially if you have animals that you can feed excess milk to or skim milk to. But I want to let you know that we do all of that too with our dairy goats. We had plenty of skim milk to feed our pigs and our chickens, and we've been able to supplement their feed with the excess milk quite well. A big selling point for a lot of people into buying a cow versus getting goats is they want the cream. They want the cream in order to make things like butter and ice cream, and a lot of people don't realize that you can make hard cheeses like cheddars and things out of goat's milk. I think people are used to seeing those, you know, small little soft goat cheese packets at the store, and then you see all these other cheeses made with like cow and sheep's milk, and so you think that this is all goats can produce for you, and that's absolutely not true. You can make all of those types of cheeses that you see made out of cow's milk with goat's milk very easily. So with the butter thing, goat's milk is naturally homogenized, and so the milk doesn't naturally separate from the cream like it does with raw cow's milk. It does separate some, but it doesn't fully separate, and so in order to get a decent quantity of cream out of your goat's milk, you're going to want a cream separator. Our cream separator was $300, which is an investment, but when I think about the investment of a cow and the inputs that they need, for us it really was a better investment to get the goats and get the cream separator and still have all of the benefits of being able to make whatever we want from the milk. Another check mark in the favor of goats for me is when we have a goat that we can't sell, which happens a lot. It's very easy for us to process that animal for meat on our farm with the tools that we have available to us here. I can't say that that would be true of a cow. We would absolutely have to take that cow to the butcher, and in order to do that, I feel like we would need a trailer, or we'd have to borrow one. There's just a lot more logistics for that and a lot more planning needed. And I really enjoy the fact that whatever we need to do with our dairy goats, we can do here, to include butchering. And if we do happen to have to load them or bring them anywhere, my minivan works very well. I've actually loaded and transported 5 adult La Mancha goats in the back of my minivan. I just put down the seats and I didn't have to think about a trailer at all. Another thing that I find quite important is sometimes we do have a hard time selling our baby goats, but again, we can keep them back for meat. But I think that goats for us are a little bit easier of a sell because most of our market here in our area is for pet goats. So with the goats, we can kind of get the best of both worlds. We do sell the does. They pretty much always sell, and so there's always that little bit of an income coming in. But then we also get the benefit of keeping some meat. So we have the best of both worlds with the income of kid sales and the very real value of meat in the freezer. And I never really addressed the fencing when I brought it up earlier. It has not been my experience that goats just go through a fence like water. I know of people who have had that experience. The fences that we have here on our farm are only a few years old. We put them in ourselves with goats in mind. There are different types of fencing that you can keep goats in. A lot of people have really good success in using electric netting and putting the goats in different areas of their pasture on their farm. I've experimented a little bit with that this year and it works really well for us here. But my favorite is the woven wire fencing that we have our goats in. It's made for sheep and goats. It's 4 feet high and I've never had any goat go under it or over it. And this particular pasture that we're in right now, it's been here for about 18 months. The one time I had a goat jump a fence, it was a different pasture. It was our round pen. And it was this goat right here. It was Pepper. She has some of the smallest legs on the whole farm. And I watched her jump that fence. And what happened was I had wanted to breed Pepper with our buck Havoc. It was the first year we had Havoc. She had never met him before, and I took her and separated her from the herd and put her in with Havoc, and she freaked out. She did not enjoy that in the least bit, and she was desperate to get back to her herd. Now it took her a couple days I watched her attempt over and over and over again to get a running start and jump that fence, and I happened to be standing right there when she succeeded. So I was able to catch her, and I ended up putting her back with the herd where she felt comfortable and safe. And I think that that's really the key. If the goat has everything they need within the confines of the fence, there's really no need for them to leave the fence. That's not to say if they have an easy out, like a nice big hole underneath the fence, that they won't be opportunistic and take that opportunity for nice forage on the other side. So obviously be smart, close up holes in your fences, but I think with herd stability, they're a lot less likely to venture far or to escape. I had mentioned before about how I assumed that our neighbor would be fine with us using his bull to service our dairy cow if we got one. And that's a very unique situation that I don't know that everybody has access to. How to get your animals bred is a very serious consideration. And for us, keeping a buck is really low maintenance. It's low impact on the farm itself. Our bucks are very easy to handle because goats they're small, they're easy to just put a leash around and for one person to lead them anywhere. A lot of cows are too, especially when their halter broken, but not a lot of people want to also keep a bull. So you'd have to potentially have your cattle AI, and a lot of people do AI with goats as well, but I think there's a lot less of a need for AI when it comes to goats, unless you want some specific genetics, because buck goats are so much easier to keep than bulls are. Now, I'm not coming on here trying to trash talk cows. I know a lot of people that keep dairy cows. I know a lot of people who currently have goats now that have a dream for a dairy cow in the future. I'm just talking about our perspective. Remember, when I first honed in on dairy goats versus cattle, I understood that my husband might be deployed for months and months on end, and I might have to deal with this operation on my own, and dairy goats just made so much sense for all of the reasons that I've listed. Truthfully too, I really like the genetic game that I can play here with my dairy goats. So right now we keep really two main breeds, Nigerian Dwarfs and La Manchas. But you can cross the two and get a mini La Mancha. And I've had a lot of fun. I've only bred for mini La Manchas once so far. Actually, we just bred again for more mini La Manchas. And it's been really fun. It's been really fun to see the development of the whole herd and to have a hand in that. And to do what I can to improve the breeds that I have on my farm for this area. I mentioned that there's a whole bunch of things that you can make with goat milk, and that was not a lie. I have a playlist that I've started. It is far from comprehensive, but there are a whole lot of things in there. I have been making hard cheeses all summer long. I can't wait to make a video of that and update the playlist. But go ahead and give this playlist a click, and I'll see you there.